I presented research last year at GeekPwn2016 where I disabled the fingerprint sensor on the smartphone device.
So does this mean you can help me hack into any ex-boyfriend's phones?
Absolutely not. I only practice ethical hacking.
Did you guys hear about the plane in India that had to be landed because a woman used her boyfriend's finger to unlock his phone, found out he was up to no good, they got into a fight, and they had to make an emergency landing. Did anyone hear about that? That is not fake news, look it up. Okay, so I'm gonna be your volunteer, your guinea pig today. Explain to me what I'm gonna be doing.
Okay, so to begin the demo, I'm gonna have you enroll your finger ID or your fingerprint to the phone so that you can unlock it.
See, I'm a total iPhone person, so this is very new to me.
Okay, I have to... Seconds.
Should I not look?
No, it's fine.
Oh, I can look.
It's already on the screen.
Oh. So. Never mind. You all know what it is.
So you have to press your finger against the back of
the back.
Sensor. Yeah.
Oh, so it's different than an iPhone where you press it on the home button, right?
I don't use iPhones, so I wouldn't know.
Oh. See, real techies don't use iPhones. Okay, so I use this finger.
Yes. Any finger you like.
So like this?
Yeah, so roll your finger around.
Press the left. Okay. Okay.
Alright, so now you should be able to lock the, press OK.
Press OK.
And now you can lock the phone again using the button on this side.
Access app lock.
Oh, hold on, let me see it.
See, I'm already doing it wrong.
So, you can lock it, now you should be able to use your finger to unlock the phone.
Okay.
So it's now
where do I use it?
Just press against the back. There, it's unlocked.
That was so easy. Are we sure we can't do this for other reasons? Kidding.
Okay, so if I now, if I try to unlock it with my fingers,
okay.
Let me see the phone, and now for example, if I try my index finger, it doesn't work. So I wrote an app to disable it, and I'm going to run it. Hopefully it doesn't crash. It can crash. It's not the most reliable exploit. Okay, so now...
Shellphish!
Exactly, yeah. So now I should be able to unlock the phone with my nose.
Is it clean?
There you go. It's been a while.
So what happens if I use my nose? Does it not?
It will work. It will work with any thing that resembles a finger. So you can, you may try if you'd like.
I have a clean nose, I promise, Nick.
Oh, maybe not.
It's makeup, it's not my fault.
Oh, well, I guess it's just my nose. Oh, okay.
There we go. Okay. I was worried that my nose was useless. I have really bad senses too, so I can barely smell, so.
Okay, well that's mostly, I think that's it for the demo.
Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, does the audience have any questions? I am about to talk about it in depth after this, after the demo. Yeah.
I'm iPhone, language. Can you start to iPhone?
No, iPhone's a harder target. iPhone's very secure, so.
Give it time, he's working on it.
Yeah. I'm not going to endorse any different products.
All right, well, you said you have a speech, so we're going to let you explain the talk a little more. With my useless nose.
Okay, so title of the talk. So a lot of the fingerprint stuff is actually handled by the TrustZone. I'm going to go into what that is in a second. This is also, by the way, this is more a classical hacking talk. This isn't going to really touch on AI, so anybody who is looking forward to an AI talk, you're going to have to wait to the next one, I'm sorry. So I'm from Shellphish, if you've heard of it. It's a CTF team at UCSB. CTFs are computer hacking competitions. CTF stands for Capture the Flag. Some of the stuff I've done is I worked on the Cyber Brain Challenge. This was a DARPA competition that's similar to the automated driving competition, but for hacking. So it had 7 computers try to automatically hack each other. It's a lot of work in that. That's automated vulnerability detection and automated exploitation. Then I also did a lot of looking at TrustZone and Android bugs with the help of some of my colleagues at UCSB. And of course, I submitted this research to GeeekPwn in 2016. So the goal is to take this phone and to completely compromise it. So we want to go from an untrusted app on the phone, just an app that you install, and we want to disable the fingerprint sensor. To do this, we need to compromise the T. The T stands for Trusted Execution Environment. It's a special part of the ARM architecture that handles a lot of sensitive data. It's supposed to be safer than the kernel, which is normally the sort of master of your computer. It's sort of the ultimate privilege level. So this is what the modern, okay, so one of my slides is missing, but this is sort of the architecture of the mobile landscape right now. Is we have two different components. We have the normal world and the secure world, here in Android and T. So we have an exception level 0, where userland apps exist. We have exception level 1, where your kernel lives and exists with higher privileges. He has control over all the userland apps. But besides that, we also have the T, which is a secure world. Inside the T, we have even more secure apps. So we have like secure payment, we have biometric sensors like the fingerprint, we have secure storage, if you want to transparently encrypt files. Then we also have a kernel to support all these different apps within the trusted world. But what's important here is that the Android kernel can't get any access to the T kernel. The T is completely sealed off. The Android kernel shouldn't know about any of the crypto keys that are in use by the T. He shouldn't be able to look up fingerprints. He shouldn't be able to look up secure payment information. So all this is handled in a secure world that the ARM architecture supports, called the TrustZone. And the T's are implementers of the TrustZone, which is the trust execution environment. Okay, those slides were backwards, but this is what we want to do. We want to start executing in userland on Android at the very top. This is where you see apps like Chrome and GChat and the Play Store are all executing. And we want to go from there to the Android kernel. So we want to get root. So that's a typical root attack. This is where most attacks stop. It's just a root. But we actually want to take it further. We want to also get access to everything that TrustZone has, like the fingerprint sensor. So to do that, we're going to take 2 extra steps. We're going to compromise a trusted app on the phone, a trustlet, as it's known, and we're also going to, from a trusted app, we're going to exploit the trusted core, which is the kernel of the trusted world. So it's a 4-stage exploit that uses a number of different bugs. So, a small disclaimer, and this goes to the man in the black sweatshirt's question about the iPhone, is that all these different phones have their own chipsets. Like Qualcomm or Samsung, they have their own chipsets that they manufacture and install in their phones. And these T's, as they're called, are specific to the chipset. So this attack only works on a particular chipset. It won't work on Apple iPhones, or it won't even work on other Android phones that use Qualcomm, because the trusted implementations will be different. So this is what a TrustZone system architecture looks like. How does an Android app even begin talking to the TrustZone? This is going to be important for understanding the chain. So we have, the biggest thing here is we have this T kernel driver. I apologize if the slides sort of came out weird when I had to adjust the dimensions. And when I did this all on Google Slides, and it looks like they kind of broke when they went to a PPT. So I apologize for some of the broken stuff. But the important part here for the first attack is we have this T kernel driver. So we have, the kernel has been modified to support making TrustZone calls. And the reason this is because to make the actual instruction to talk to the TrustZone, the SMC instruction, as you can see in the SMC trustlets, we need to be privileged. So that's a supervised remote instruction. Our userland app can't execute that instruction without faulting. So we need a kernel driver that can support this API that userland apps can use to make TrustZone calls. And then once we make an SMC to a trustlet, the trustlets themselves need to talk to the trusted core to do normal userland stuff like request IPC primitives and request things like mapping in memory. One more step I forgot to mention is another component is we have this daemon that runs as root that can give us a final descriptor back to the kernel. So when an Android app really wants to talk to the kernel driver, he makes a connection to this daemon. The daemon hands him back a file descriptor, and from that file descriptor, that's a file descriptor to the device driver. We then make ioctl calls, which is the underlying component of this API, which supports TrustZone from an Android app. So the first part is we want to user land to kernel. So we target the actual TrustZone driver here. I'm going to go over some of the bugs I used. The TrustZone driver kind of already went to what it does, but another key thing it does is it supports logging in apps. So the T daemon actually will open up that the device driver, and he'll do a number of ioctls to log an app in. So once you have the file descriptor back, you've already been logged in and registered by the driver. So your credentials will always be passed up to TrustZone whenever my Android app wants to make a call on the TrustZone. What this means is that this allows the trustlets to do permission checking based on what app I am, because they know who I am. Even though they exist in a completely different world, the TrustZone kernel or the TrustZone driver has taken care of making sure that the TrustZone knows who I am. So it supports all these different things, and it also will sanitize the parameters I send up to the TrustZone, because I need to be able to send things like buffers or integers up to TrustZone. So there's two vulnerabilities here. I only have time to really go into one of them. And so this is, so a little primer on this is that because these two, the trustless and the kernel exist in different worlds, they have completely different address spaces. So we need a trusted core to be able to translate virtual addresses in my userland app to physical addresses that the T knows. I'm also going to go over this kind of quickly to get to more interesting stuff. But in general, they exist in two different worlds with different address spaces, and to support this, we have the trusted kernel who has a one-to-one mapping with the physical address space, and he knows the virtual addresses of all the trustlets, and our userland kernel, or excuse me, our normal world kernel knows the physical addresses of all of its virtual pages, so it can make things compatible for the TrustZone by translating virtual addresses into physical addresses. So this is the first bug. It's an out-of-bounds write. So this occurs when we want to send parameters up to the TrustZone. And one of the parameters we can send is a memory buffer. And there's three things to make a memory buffer. There's the actual address of the buffer itself, there's a size of the buffer, and there's an offset into that buffer. Now it turns out that the offset in that buffer is completely unsanitized. So that can be a 64-bit int. We can point that anywhere. So we can essentially forge any physical address and pass it up to TrustZone, and it will do whatever it's supposed to do with a buffer argument. So this is dependent on what API call you're actually making, but it will essentially write to a physical address, and that's it. So we need to find a trustlet that will write a good value to this so we can exploit the kernel. So this is also a boomerang attack, which takes advantage of the fact that the TrustZone doesn't know about the differences between userland and the kernel in the normal world. So to exploit this, what we want to do is take over a file object. This is pretty, might be a little bit too technical, but what we're going to do is try to take over a file operations table and point that to a bunch of ROP gadgets so we can get arbitrary read and write in a kernel. So the first thing we do is we do some reversion. We find a trustlet that will give us a write. So here's one of the first examples I found. And what this call does, global command ID need load app, is going to tell you your buffer will point to a UUID, and it's going to look up that UUID and see if that app needs loading. So in the normal world, I can arbitrarily request that I want trustlet functionality. And before I do that, I might want to say, is this trustlet even loaded? And I can do that with this command. And to respond, it will take my address, it will look at 16 bytes, it will determine if those 16 bytes exist as one of the trustlets or as an identifier for one of the trustlets loaded, and if it is, it will write a 0 to my buffer. If it's not, it will write a 1, as in true, it does need loading. So what this allows us to do is to write a 1 to like a little endian 1 to anywhere in memory. So to exploit this, we're going to take the fops table pointer and we're going to do a couple different writes on it to point it into userland, or userland process. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our bug. Right now you can see at the top we're pointing to the original fops table. At the bottom we point to userland memory. So we do 3 writes. Eventually we get this to an address that we can map in user space. This all kind of depends on like how the kernel is split with userland. But this can essentially give us arbitrary read and write. Once we have the FOPS table, we can point to ROP gadgets inside the kernel, and we can read and write kernel memory arbitrarily. And from there, it's easy to get root. We can set the UIDs to 0, for example. We can find a cred structure from the file, and we've rooted the phone. Okay, great. That's a typical Android root using a kernel bug. Now, for the more interesting step, where we actually want to go to the TrustZone. Now that we're kernel, we can do some things that are more interesting. We can bypass this entire logging in procedure that the driver initially sets up. We know we can be any app we want. We can talk to any trustlet. The one I actually was most interested in to begin with was just secure file storage. So this is a functionality that allows you to transparently encrypt and decrypt files on disk. So if you have a phone with a high disk application or the Files app, and you might have this safe feature. So the safe feature allows, it doesn't tell you what it's doing, but it says your files are safe. And what it's doing is it's actually using the TrustZone to encrypt files for you. So you put your PIN in, you give it a file, and it will transparently encrypt it, and with a key that only the TrustZone knows, or only the TrustZone should know. The kernel, the Android kernel, should not be able to access this key. So the bug here is a classic type confusion with the parameters. So as you can see here, this is how we pass parameters into a T. There's two different options. So the first one I talked about was the buffer argument. That was where the first bug existed with processing buffer args. But you can also just pass in values, like an A and a B, 2 integers. Now, the way they support this union is they have an integer which encodes the types of the parameters. So the TrustZone kernel is going to, or the TrustZone kernel driver, the TCNS client driver, is responsible for populating that param types variable correctly. So he's going to say the first param of the 4 is integer, the second one is a buffer, the third one is integer, so on and so forth. And this will allow the trustlets to actually say, okay, this is the integer, I need to treat it a special way, or I shouldn't trust its arguments as an address. Now, unfortunately, the file storage app doesn't do this. It never checks any of the param types. So we get a typical type confusion. So this allows us to pass in 2 integers as a buffer and size argument. So here, what we can do is we can pass in the first argument as integers. That's our file descriptor, so we've already opened the file. And our second argument will be an A and B, which it thinks is a buffer and a size, but is actually 2 integers. And then we'll treat that as a buffer. So what this allows us to do is to get arbitrary read and write using the read and the write storage command IDs. So this is kind of like if you can imagine in a kernel exploit, if the address limit doesn't exist, and you can pass the buffer argument to read or to write into the kernel. This would allow you to essentially get read and write in the kernel. In this case, we're getting read and write in trustlet because it doesn't actually have any understanding of if it should trust these pointers or not. So from here, to get code execution, we're going to hijack a malloc function. So the way I did this is I was reversing and looking for any way I could hijack PC. And inside malloc, the tmalloc, so they've implemented their own version of malloc, they have this function pointer table which can handle different sizes of dynamic allocation requests. So what we want to do is we want to write to this new secure file. We want to point its read member at malloc to find its address, and then we want to, or actually we want to do write to do leaks and read to actually read into memory. And once we do that, we can control the function pointer inside the trustlet. All we have to do is get malloc to be called. Now the trick here is also finding a place where we can stuff shellcode and execute arbitrary trustlet code. And here's kind of what the address space of a trustlet looks like. We have the text at the top, we have the BSS, we have the trusted core, that's the kernel, and then interestingly enough, all of the memory references that we passed in, the buffers that we passed in as different parameters, those get remapped into the trustlet. And those are also as read-write executable regions. So it's a very convenient place to stuff for shellcode. You can essentially just pass it up, it will be allocated somewhere above in a higher address in the trusted core, and we can point there, and we begin to execute our shellcode. Now there's one small problem. The new phones began to implement some higher level or OS level mitigations that you see in normal operating systems, like Linux. They have ASLR. So as you can see, they generate a random vector only 1 byte, and they use that to load the base address of a trustlet. So this is a very primitive version of ASLR, and the randomization takes place, but just once. If the thing crashes, it needs to be loaded again. It will be loaded to the exact same address. So it's pretty easy to defeat this. It's just 1 byte. We could do 256 different attempts to actually try to brute force it. Or, since we're root, we can read any file on disk, and there happens to be a diagnostic log that we can access, which will give us where the current PC is. So we can actually crash the trustlet. We can read this log, and we can see that, oh, cached storage crashed at this address, and we have a simple ASLR defeat. Okay, so now we have code execution to trustlet. We've defeated ASLR. We've hijacked the PC. We are executing shellcode in the trustlet. We still can't quite override the fingerprint sensor. I didn't target the fingerprint sensor. In fact, I couldn't find it. I'll go into that later. So the only way I know how to do this is I at least need to get to the kernel of the TrustZone. Now, what does the TrustZone kernel do? As I already mentioned, it supports IPC. It allows trustlets to talk to one another. It supports loading of trustlets. It supports the memory address translation features. These ASLR, we need somebody who knows where all these things are mapped. Now, there's one big vulnerability here. You might be able to already guess what it is, like sort of similar to the last one. I didn't get a CV for this, unfortunately. But the big bug here is there's absolutely no pointer sanitization. So if you imagine a kernel where they do absolutely no access OK checks, or they take your parameters and they never test them against the kernel address limit, this is what we have. So at this point, this is mostly reverse engineering. We just need to find a sequence of system calls which will allow us to get arbitrary right, or at least allow us to get sort of root in this trusted core context, or arbitrary code execution. So a lot of this stuff I didn't have a direct understanding of. I looked at this giant system call table, and I sort of tried to understand what primitives they would give me, and they would give me a lot of these different primitives. So a little thing about the trusted core environment, as an attacker's perspective, we need to know what kind of defense mechanisms it's using. So there's absolutely no ASLR. This isn't that weird for a kernel. There is KSLR, but it's fairly weak, even on Linux. There's no ASLR. There is PXN. What this is page execute never. It's an ARM feature. It's like SMEP on Intel x86. What this means is that we can't point the kernel's function pointer into a userland address. It will refuse to execute it, which is kind of interesting considering they have another bug which does absolutely no pointer sanitization. They do actually create the page tables correctly so that userland and supervisor mode pages are distinguished. But there is no PAN. This is a more advanced security feature that you can find. And this is page access never. And this would prevent the kernel from ever accessing userland pages without going through a special gate. So this will make our lives easier. We can do things like forge structures in a userland and point to those, and the kernel won't know the difference between a kernel structure and a userland structure. There is no depth, so as far as I can tell, all the dynamically allocated memory inside the trusted core was actually executable. So you can allocate a kernel heap buffer, you can write your shellcode there, and you can jump to it. All that stuff seems to be executable. Now it supports a lot of system calls. Like I said, I had no idea what all these did. I just began reversing them, and a lot of them were actually behind permission checks, so I couldn't actually hit them from the secure file storage. So what's interesting is they did have the foresight to limit system calls to particular trustlets. So some trustlets can't make certain system calls. So I didn't have a magical right argument 1, argument 0 gadget, which would have immediately defeated it, but I did have a number of these other interesting primitives. Like I could write the current name of the trustlet to anywhere in memory. I could just do an arbitrary stir copy. I could allocate a pointer in a kernel buffer and get that address passed back to me. So I have a number of these ways to start getting it. I'm going to kind of skip over this. Essentially, you can combine all these different primitives. You can link the slides later. I'm sure GeeekPwn will post them, otherwise I will. You have all these different primitives on how these little things you can do, and you can combine these to get a very nice arbitrary right primitive inside the kernel. And once you have that, you have shellcode. And now you're root of the entire phone. You have real root in the normal world, but you also have code execution in the highest possible level of the ARM chip, the trusted core. So now for the final part, disabling the fingerprint sensor. So like I said earlier, I had absolutely no idea where the fingerprint sensor was. These are the trustlets that I had access to when I just dumped the TrustZone partition off the phone. I had some weird things like gatekeeper, which might be the fingerprint, the keyboard, the keymaster, secure storage, but nothing that should look like fingerprint checking. I mean, it should be pretty complex to implement like fingerprint recognition, right? It should be larger than any one of these. These are all very small files. So you need to find this. So how do you find the fingerprint sensor? So first thing I did is I just listed all the processes off the phone. I found something called Fingerprint Deep, very suspicious, and I began sort of poking at it. So you list. So one thing I failed to mention is that to talk to this TrustZone driver to make TrustZone calls from a user land app, what you need to do is go through that entire mess of talking to user land daemon, then making the octals and sanitizing parameters. Now, they've actually written a library to handle all this for you called libteek. So I needed to find this. Anyone who's talking to TrustZone needs to be linking in libteek and making those API calls. So Fingerprint Deep didn't have libteek in its memory map, but it did have libfbc tag. Now this is interesting. I started following this and I began reversing it, and the first thing I saw was it making these teek calls. As you can see, teek open session. And it had this really weird file that it was passing in as an open session and loading this weird image. So request to load this really weird file. If you call file on this, unlike all the other trustlets, it's not an L file. So it's not actually executable. It's just raw data. So it's an encrypted trustlet, was my guess. So what I needed to do next was to, with my new permissions, I can read any memory I want, I can dump it to disk. I needed to find the decrypted fingerprint guy. So the way I did this is once I had code execution, I would crawl all the decrypted memory. So this is all pretty kind of hacky, but I would just crawl T memory for anything that resembled an ARM instruction. Once I found an ARM instruction, that would probably be a trustlet. So from there, if I had something that looked like a trustlet, what I would do is I would dump the surrounding areas, and I would look for any string references in that file that might indicate a fingerprint. So I look for keywords like FBC, fingerprint, fingerprint D, pretty simple. And eventually I did find it. So I found the trustlet, I dumped it out, it happened to have all these symbols inside of it, so it was really easy to reverse. I found a function that was called identify image, and this guy was taking an argument and writing a 1 or a 0 based off of some buffer. So the first thing I did is I just tried always writing a 1, patching the phone so that or always writing a 0, I suppose, and then writing into this argument, and then returning. So I have to hot patch the identify image function, and that seemed to work. And so this is exactly what the exploit in the phone is doing. It's gaining all of these permissions over time by using different bugs and different exploits, and then eventually it crawls all the T memory, it finds the decrypted trustlet, it goes into ARM and it disables, makes every single page writable, and then it hot patches this trustlet and returns it. And that's how you disable the fingerprint sensor on a phone. If anyone has any questions, let me know. That's it.
Wow. How many of you watched that and was a little mind blown for at least one part? Any of you? Because I was nodding the whole time, Nick, and I'm like, Francis, why are you nodding? You can't even figure out your iCloud. Thank you, Nick. Can we give him a round of applause? Another one. Any questions? I know he got his question answered, but anyone else? Come on, everyone. Motivation Monday. Oh, right there in the blue shirt.
What inspired you to do this hack?
Good question. So when I was at UCSB, one of my colleagues, Arvind Macheri, was doing a lot of research on the TrustZone. He's really amazing. He actually found the very first bug that I mentioned, and once he found that, he wanted me to exploit it. He was busy doing other research, so I wrote an exploit for it, and then from there I sort of became interested in what the actual kernel driver was doing. So I was interested in the actual TrustZone, seeing if I could compromise the TrustZone as well as just the kernel driver. So a lot of it was inspired by his research and the work he was doing in the lab.
Anyone else? Going once, going twice? No, I'm just kidding. All right, Nick, thank you so much.
I just want to thank GeeekPwn for inviting me out here. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nick.